Yeah, welcome to this talk about what to test in JavaScript. But if you're familiar actually with code testing, the answer should be everything. So actually, I came up with more or less like a different conclusion, not necessarily what to test in JavaScript, but more like what kind of tools to use in JavaScript and which tool to match actually which with which kind of code. And I'm slowly leading up to that, but before we actually start, my name was perfectly pronounced, so thank you. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm owner of a little company called Yireo. And what I do is I give trainings to Magento developers. I'm also organizing a couple of events a month ago or so, MageTestFest. And for this kind of thing, I'm announced Magento Master in 2017. But to be honest, I'm just simply a Dutch boy who's a little bit sick actually at this moment. So I apologize for my voice. Hopefully it's not getting worse, or hopefully it's getting better. And please, if you want to join me in the speaker room afterwards for a Q&A on JavaScript, I might doze off, fall asleep, and etc. But I'll try to stay awake for this talk anyway. So what we're going to cover is actually JavaScript testing. So before I actually start with the slides, how many of you are developers? Raise your hands. So that's the majority. JavaScript developers? Well, this is basically also the issue that we're facing, that if we talk about Magento development, it used to be actually PHP for a long time, and now we're slowly introducing more and more JavaScript. And then because PHP testing is a big thing, JavaScript testing should also be a big thing. But then it leads to a discussion like what kind of tools we're going to use to do that testing with. And that's actually the majority of my talk, like what kind of tools are handy in what kind of circumstance. But first, to get the fundamentals straight, we shouldn't have inline JavaScript functionality. So if we're talking about JavaScript, we're always going to implement it within an HTML document, and the HTML document shouldn't have any inline JavaScript. So if I ask you guys if you've ever opened up the HTML source of the default Luma theme and then scanned the source code of, then at least one guy is laughing. But it's a goal to actually reach to. So first of all, no inline JavaScript functionality, leading actually that all of the JavaScript functionality should actually be placed in library. And that library should be using require.js at this moment in the whole Magento 2 stack to load dependencies. And then in the end, for instance, if you have a configuration or if you have a JavaScript component that does something in the HTML document, all of the reference to HTML should be like using variables. Using these fundamentals, we can slowly dive into the JavaScript part, what to test, and at what kind of level to test. Now, how many of you are familiar with testing or practicing testing in a daily life? That's like, again, not the majority of the room, but that's okay. But I'm sure that you're familiar with the concepts of testing, that we have different frameworks to do different kinds of testing, and one of those levels would be unit testing. And then we can talk about a couple of tools like Jasmine, Mocha, QUnit, QUnit, I'm never really sure how to pronounce it. Different level, integration testing. Require.js is then not the testing framework, but it's just a tool that becomes useful when dealing with integrations of different dependencies. The functional tests, the Magento functional testing framework would pop up in this kind of field. And then we have end-to-end, for instance, Selenium using Codeception, which is actually also part of the new Magento functional testing framework. So it more or less hooks together. So this is not meant to be a listing, but it's more meant to be shaping like what kind of levels do we need to think about, what are we trying to do actually with tests in the first place. Now, I'm slowly going to dive into the tools, and I'm leading you guys up to a couple of code segments, dummy examples, to prove a certain point. And actually, the first slide, when I dive into the tools available in JavaScript, actually already proves that point a little bit. Because one of the questions you have when running JavaScript would be, in what kind of environment would you want to run JavaScript? Well, normally what we do with Magento is, of course, we're building a web shop based within the web browser of a client. So it would be logical also to test JavaScript on that same level, which would mean browser-based testing. But we could also use a command line tool for this. And instead of actually driving a browser which might slow down tests, running tests within the Node CLI, for instance, would be a lot faster. I'm not answering the question yet, but it's just a question that we should ask ourselves. Now, the testing frameworks are all over the place. So it's leading up to a huge listing, and this is just the beginning. And the interesting thing is actually, if we compare this to PHP, then the number of PHP frameworks, the most popular frameworks, is much smaller. Leading also to a conclusion, JavaScript, well, the running joke is always that every new week there's a new library available. And actually, me and Michael from Codeception, we had a talk this morning, and he mentioned, like, well, what is the point of JavaScript testing when actually the code is changing daily as well? But that being said, there's a lot of tools available. The difference between PHP-Unit, for instance, where you write the test in the testing framework of PHP-Unit, where you run the tests also with PHP-Unit, is actually that with JavaScript, the things are split up. We not only have a testing framework, but we also have assertion libraries. So suddenly the thing that is composing a test is put into yet another library. And I'm just not diving into the details here, but I'm just showing there's a lot of choice. Even worse, if we then have written a test in a certain test framework with another library using those library calls to create assertions, then we actually still need to figure out how to run those tests in the first place. And then again, in PHP, this is much simpler. The tool that you use is also running the tests. PHP-Unit, for instance, you run a test in PHP-Unit by calling upon PHP-Unit, but then suddenly in JavaScript, it's basically all over the place. And I'm placing tape here within parentheses for a reason, but that's popping up in a bit as well. Now the list goes on and on. So we have a lot of different tools, and we have a lot of different strategies also that we can choose from. Besides actually having a test, the big question that I'm slowly leaning to is actually if we have a small piece of code, and that piece of code is a single functionality not depending on anything else, then it's easy to create a test. But the tests actually become more complicated as soon as we have dependencies between our code and something else. And one of the most straightforward examples would be having a piece of JavaScript, use jQuery to get maybe to the HTML document, and how to test that. So Sign-on, ESLint, MochaJS, they're just a bunch of tools that you can again incorporate in your own tests to do stuff to do that testing for you. But that's not really the point. I'm going to make the point actually by using a couple of examples. For instance, using Jasmine, because it's the tool that is incorporated in the Magento framework itself. So Magento has written JavaScript tests and has used Jasmine to actually get there. But I'm cheating a little bit. I'm not going to show real Magento code. I'm just going to go back to the basics of Jasmine to show you actually how JavaScript code could be tested with Jasmine without any Magento being involved. To get started, Jasmine is a JavaScript tool that uses NPM Node Package Manager to be installed, or you could use different tools as well, but let's just pick NPM. And then in the end, you could install a couple of packages. For instance, Jasmine Node, for instance, Generator Jasmine. And Generator Jasmine gives you a little widget also using human, that's the Y and the O, to create a new skeleton of a Jasmine framework. And then you're ready to go. You have two different files, an HTML file and a JavaScript file. And actually, this is already showing what Jasmine tries to do. Instead of having a standalone piece of JavaScript, it's going to apply that JavaScript onto an HTML document. Hence, you need some kind of tool to combine HTML and JavaScript in real life to do the testing for you. well, the tool that we refer to then is a browser, because that's what we do all the time with the browser. We load an HTML document and then JavaScript on top of it. Now, besides Jasmine, which is only the functional, the testing framework to write the test in, I also need something else, the test runner, to actually run the test within the browser. And that's actually Karma. So again, we can install Karma, we can set it up to be working in a certain way, and then we come up to the point that we need a configuration of Karma to hook it into Jasmine, so then we can just run Karma to perform the tests of Jasmine. So I'm not going through the details, but it's a bunch of configuration lines. And then we're ready to actually create a test. And the test is simply, well, it's a really stupid example, expect true to be true. So it's not there to do anything useful, but it's there to show you the structure of a test. We run this function. Karma is running the function by using Jasmine to interpret actually the describe and the it and the expect. And then the end result is that the test succeeds, so hooray, we can move on. Now, Karma and Jasmine is actually the combination that Magento has chosen. But referring back to the listing of all of those other tools, I'm just a simple Dutch boy. What I saw in these other tools, I said to myself, well, let's try them out. And let's see like, what is the difference between the set that Magento has chosen and another set, for instance, based on Mocha. So I'm now turning the same configuration that I had right now into a Mocha configuration. I'm installing Mocha, and I'm installing this Karma Mocha plugin. Then in the end, I need to modify my Karma configuration so that not Jasmine is used, but Mocha is used. And then in the end, I'm able to run the test again. However, the interesting thing is now that I can run the test in two different ways, because Mocha allows me to call upon it through Karma. So then the test runner actually is Karma based upon this browser thing. But the same JavaScript code could also be executed from the command line using Node. So suddenly I have one tool set, and I have two ways to call upon the same testing code, command line using Node, so that's the example above, or Karma within the browser. So I thought like, that's cool, but that assumes that the test is actually useful in both the browser and the command line script. Because if I'm referring to something that only lives in the browser, of course my test is going to fail. My JavaScript code has dependencies, and if one of those dependencies is something in the browser, or likewise something in Node, then the other environment doesn't work anymore. Meaning that basically the choice of the tools depends on what kind of code I'm actually testing for. So the circumstances of how I want to test is actually determined by what kind of code I actually test for, and the testing code itself as well. Also to show you a slight difference, earlier I had a test written in Jasmine, now I have a test written in Mocha, and now the slight difference is that we have a constant assert that we need to import from some other library, and then we could call upon assert.equal. So there's some code changes, meaning that if I choose Jasmine, all of my tests are written in Jasmine, or if I choose Mocha, all of my tests are written in Mocha. And of course I can migrate all of my testing code by replacing a couple of lines, but I personally like to write my tests once and then see them work for me, instead of actually me modifying the test every time again and again, just to change the underlying testing framework. Now, on top of, slide back, on top of actually Mocha and Karma, I can also add Chai, because the Assertion library here is actually depending on the Assertion library shipped within, I have to say that correctly, shipped within Mocha itself. Now I can replace that actually with Chai, so that's just proving a point, like I can add everything that I want to add. I'm installing it through npm, I'm modifying the configuration so it actually works, and then in the end I'm able to run the test. Why? Simply to replace actually the normal Assertion library that I had earlier now with the Chai Assertion library, but there's no real point to make. to me, actually, choosing chai with or without was actually not proving any point, but it's actually proving a point that there's a lot of different tools in JavaScript on the whole that we could use, but there's actually not a real strong reason why we would use it. So that's basically, again, the point that I want to make. Why do we migrate from one JavaScript framework to another, or shouldn't we? So yet another library, Tape. Tape is completely different because it's actually, it's both the testing framework and the test runner, and basically everything in one go. You can install it, you can run it, and the only downside is that all of the tests that you've written in the past need to be changed again to facilitate Tape. So I don't recommend you actually trying it out on your own production test or whatever, that you convert all of the code from Jasmine to Mocha to Chai just for the sake of it. Basically, you want to wonder, the question is which tool to use for which kind of circumstance, and that's the real issue. So, some thoughts. Because we've seen simply a lot of different code and a lot of different tools that prove the point that they work, but why? In what kind of circumstance? And that's actually the big question that we need to ask ourselves. Well, first of all, I don't care. I'm a simple Dutch boy. I'm just, give me a tool set and I try it out, and then I can see that it's working. And likewise, nobody's forcing you to do testing. Well, maybe some. Some people want you to test everything, but nobody's forcing you. You should see the benefit of your own to actually implement testing in your own coding procedure. So then the next question, what kind of tools? Well, nobody's forcing you to use a certain tool. Choose whatever tool you see fit. The only thing that I personally like is when I'm trying to write tests in PHP or in JavaScript, I'd like those tests to be run quickly, because the quicker the tests are running, the easier I can run a test after modifying the code. Theoretically, every time when I modify the code, I do a git commit, and then as a post-commit message or post-commit procedure, I could run those tests as well. Likewise, it's also proving that there's a lot of different tools, and they all have different opinions on how the assertions or the running of the tests should work. And personally, I just stick with a certain kind of testing, and I'm happy with it because it's running tests. And likewise, the smaller the code base, the easier it becomes also to determine what kind of tools do I need to test, do we need to use to run the test with. So for instance, we've seen Jasmine and Karma using a browser, but we also saw Tape as in another library which allows you to do command line testing. So which environment to use boils down actually to what kind of code that you want to test things with. So basically, it's leading up to what kind of things, what kind of dependencies do the JavaScript parts have with the rest of the environment. And one of the questions I faced actually with writing JavaScript code is, if I have a dependency with the HTML document, and I want to run the tests within Node.js, I don't have a browser available. Am I going to mock the browser? Am I going to fake as if the browser was there? Or is that the wrong approach? And it's still a question, so. Another one. If I have a dependency with my own code with jQuery, am I going to mock jQuery? Am I going to replace it with something else? Or am I going to include jQuery in my own code and then get things going from there? And the important thing to realize is, if we're not mocking jQuery, but our tests are dependent on jQuery itself, it's no longer a unit test, but it's an integration test. And if we're mixing in the browser, it's no longer an integration test, but it's an end-to-end browser test. So it's depending actually on what kind of code we have available, leading up to more advanced topics within JavaScript, spying, which is not necessarily something you do related to testing, but it's more that if I call upon jQuery, I could spy jQuery so that I'm notified that I'm actually using jQuery. So it's telling me something about how my code is working, which might be useful, but it's not really related to unit testing or something else. Now, with Magento, we're slowly leading up to that JavaScript should be run in Magento using JavaScript components. So they've tried to single out functionality within a specific JavaScript file, and then we label that file a JavaScript component using require.js, which is the define statement, to include dependencies, in this case jQuery, then execute a certain function. And then in this case, well, my JavaScript component is really simple and straightforward. I'm simply modifying the HTML document using jQuery, and that's basically my functionality. But how to test this? What are the dependencies? So if I would create a unit test for this part, then I need to fake jQuery, because a unit test is testing the unit, and I don't want other units to be included. So I need to pretend that jQuery is actually jQuery, but it's actually something else. I'm going to mock jQuery to mimic the behavior of jQuery. Likewise, jQuery is modifying the HTML document, so I'm also going to mock the HTML document. Well, and I've been there, done that, and I'm not really happy with it, because when I tried to do that, I took the command line approach. I wanted to run a test using Mocha and later on tape, based upon Node. So I didn't want to have an environment with a browser. I wanted to have an environment without the browser. So I installed JSDOM, I installed jQuery. I also installed require.js, which was a little bit weird because Magento is installed with require.js, but that's the web-based version, and I installed the NPM version on top of it. And I got a major fail. jQuery requires a window with a document. And I've honestly tried to fix this error, and I spent about, well, 12, 13 hours or so only on this specific error. Then I gave up, and I concluded it's insane actually to create a test within a command line environment like Node to run a test that is actually testing something with dependencies with jQuery or the HTML document. It's not the right tool for the right kind of code that you're trying to test. So my recommendation would be use Jasmine and Karma instead. So I've been there, done that. I can't recommend anything else except for the thing that Magento has already created. So it leads to a couple of questions. Mocking jQuery or just using it? Well, my personal take is actually don't try to mock it. As soon as you have a piece of JavaScript that is depending on jQuery, it's simply too hard to actually replace jQuery with a mock version and then try to pretend that you're in a browser. Instead of actually trying to pretend that you're in a browser, be in the browser. Use a JavaScript testing tool that is based in the browser. But if you're not, then actually we could run in Node.js nonetheless. Another one is actually that the JavaScript component that we just saw, let me go back, is loading itself through a define statement. My time is up. What should I do actually to get my screen back? Ah, wait. So I have a couple of dependencies, jQuery. I have a function, but then actually the return statement of my function is that thing that is being exposed to the outside world. The pattern that this JavaScript component is following is I have dependencies. That's something that I put in, jQuery, and I get something out of the library, and that's the return statement. And the whole thing is actually that, if I move forward again, this pattern is called the revealing module pattern. And within the revealing module pattern, you always have a module that reveals something to the outside world. It returns something to the outside world. And only that thing that is actually being revealed, the return statement, is something I can test for. But all of the things, all of the code that is actually within the code base before the return statement is reached, is that something I should test for or not? And then actually my current answer is no, you don't, because actually everything that is inside a black box is something you cannot test for. And the reason why it's not testable is because it's actually inside a black box. So the reason why you put something in a black box is so that other people don't see it anymore. We are not going to test something in a black box. Likewise in PHP with private methods, the same in JavaScript, but then using the revealing module pattern. Another one would be depending on require.js or faking it. But again, I wrote it down like a question, but I'm already almost halfway there with the conclusion. Don't. Maybe if we're going to depend on require.js, then simply try to include require.js, because it's simply too hard to mock require.js, which is again the fundament actually of all of the other code that you're going to create in JavaScript components. Meaning that my test has dependencies. It could be that the test is actually the browser. It could be that the test is actually a dependency with jQuery. It could be require.js. No matter how we take it, actually all our code is always depending on something. And then the question is actually, what kind of code are we testing with what kind of tools? Because if the testing is if the code is only being run within the browser, it's okay to actually use a JavaScript framework that is running in the browser. But likewise, and I didn't really put it down as a separate bullet point, likewise, if the code is actually not depending on the browser, it should be possible to test that code using Node.js, a non-browser environment. So it depends basically on what kind of tools, what kind of frameworks you would use for what kind of circumstance. And you reach that by creating smaller code that is testable on its own. You refactor the code by using dependency injection. By limiting the dependencies per JavaScript component, and as soon as one JavaScript component has too many dependencies, or actually part of dependencies might be related to the browser and the other part might be related to something else, split it up into different JavaScript components. And then suddenly you have a JavaScript component that runs within Jasmine and the other one runs within, well, whatever you want to do, tape. So that's basically the point. The good refactoring of JavaScript components should lead to reusable code. And I actually didn't really mention it yet because it's a discussion far too hard. But theoretically, with the new PWA coming up in Magento 2.4, then theoretically some part of the JavaScript code is already separated basically from the dependencies that are specific to Magento 1, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. But not, so I lost myself with the point. So basically that if you refactor the code good enough, then theoretically a JavaScript component could be compatible with both the new framework of PWA and the current framework based on require.js and knockout and etc. Meaning that we also need smaller components to get there, and basically the purpose of the library would also dictate basically what kind of tool you would use to run the test with. A general purpose library shouldn't actually depend on require.js. A pure function shouldn't actually depend on require.js. A model and a view that may be related to knockout, but make sure that there's no overlapping functionality between the model or the view and something else. And that's basically my whole point. Choose the right tool for the right job. Each part of the code has its own procedure, its own underlying thought of how to test that code. Thank you, and Jakuyu.